left off talking about the effective rate of protection on a tariff. So what was the gist of what we were doing? Who can give me a recap as I'm rewriting some of what we had?
Basically determine the world market trade, something like that. International trade market.
Yeah, and so what about it?
Actually, that was the last thing.
Yes, the effective rate of protection. So what was the distinction that we're making that was a little bit different? It kind of comes down to this last column.
And just no tariff versus tariff and how much protection it provides.
Yes. All right. So no tariff versus tariff, and then how much protection it provides. But then the new wrinkle that we hadn't gotten to yet was the idea of putting a tariff on intermediate goods too. So we looked at Canada and the United States on how they let intermediate goods possibly go back and forth between them, and maybe not necessarily the final goods. So with free trade, we had a $100 DVR world price, and of that free trade, $60 were with intermediate goods, and then it would come to the United States would have $40 of value added to it. So if you look at the composition of the DVR, 60% rest of the world parts or components, and 40% domestic components. Now, if we impose a tariff, what was the lesson we learned? A 30% tariff. What was the breakdown of the composition?
$70 in value add, and the effective rate of protection would be 75%.
Okay, so who got all the benefit of the tariff? The domestic producers in the United States, which is the story that we tell when we did the picture of the tariff. And it looked like this with the tariff. There's the world price. We add the tariff to it, and we get the price with the tariff. The domestic producers enjoy the higher price because they don't have to pay the tariff. It's only the foreigners that pay the tariff. And so this makes sense here when we start to look at this breakdown. If 60 bucks of that DVR were coming from the rest of the world anyway, then the value added, even though that's kind of a questionable wording to it, all of the value, the remainder, goes to the domestic producers. All right, so that's our breakdown, and we calculated the rate of tariff protection as the effective rate of protection was equal to the value added, the new value added minus the old value added divided by the old value added. And that gave us, in this case, the 70 minus 30 is $30 worth of protection divided by the 40 effectively gave a 75% rate of protection. All right, that's just review from what we did last time. So, what if we now also add a 50% tariff onto the components?
Components cost $90.
Yes, right? So 50% tariff, so that's going to go up. What about the world price? Does it go up?
Yeah.
Or I shouldn't say it, I shouldn't quite say it that way, does it?
I guess it would be up to
This is not really the world price. This is the price within our nation. The world price is still 100. Within our nation, it's 30. Would that tariff on the components change that top
It
number?
would go up from the 100, right?
Right.
It would be 130 still.
It would be 130 still, that's right.
Would it still have the tariffs, or would you have to count the mobile tariff or no?
No. Because who's getting hit with the 30%?
The export.
The person who's selling the good, if we're the United States, that's the person who's getting hit with the tariff. Now they bought $60 worth of components also. That's the new twist. Did they pay a tariff on their components? So if I'm the Japanese maker of the DVR, did I pay 50% on those components? If the components came from Indonesia,
It depends on Indonesia's.
so here's Indonesia, here's Japan, here's the United States. There we go. So components come from Indonesia. When does it get hit with these tariffs? And how does it impact the home country is kind of the big question.
I guess the import or components would make that up to $90 for the US.
Yep.
So, those positions that-
So we got that down for sure, right? So when the US brings in the components that are key for the DVR, they're paying 90 now.
How'd you know that?
50% in, I put the I here, I didn't even say what it was, but this was intermediate
So
goods.
Japan's.
I wrote it out more in your notes
Japan's
before, but
tariffing
intermediate
us
goods.
now, is that what you're saying? For imported?
No, this is all US. We've got a output tariff, a tariff on the DVR, the final product of 30%, which is what we did here.
Okay.
And then we've got, in addition to that now, an intermediate good or the component tariff of 50%. So, Taylor, what'd you say? 130. It's still 130, right? Because the Japanese people didn't have to pay the 90. They're just still paying 60. And so when they ship it over, they're willing to sell it for 100. If it was free trade, they'd still be selling it for 100. But with the tariff, it ends up being 130 for the Japanese DVR. The American firm sitting over here in Kansas making it now has to pay 90, right, for their intermediate good. What are they going to get for their DVR? 130, because it's a competitive market. If the Americans have their DVRs too high, I'm just going to buy Japanese. So because it's competitive, it's 130, and therefore the value add effectively is 40. And so what is the effective rate of protection? Nothing. Depending on which direction we're going. But if we go, what's our status quo? If our status quo is free trade, the effective rate of protection is 0. But if our status quo is this, it's a negative number. Yeah, you're actually hurting it, right? So all of these things kind of depend on what the status quo is. Where did we start with? Where are we going? Is kind of the effective way, the marginal analysis always to effective decision making is where did we start? So let me go ahead and write that out. A couple of cases. So note, case 1, if we're at free trade to the double tariff, T equal 30 and TI equal 50, if we go from free trade to that, then our effective rate of protection is 40 minus 40 divided by 40, gives me a big fat 0%. Case number 2, if my status quo was tariff of 30% on the output going to the double tariff and adding on the intermediate good tariff of 50%, if that's my analysis, then the effective rate of protection is 40 minus 70 divided by 70 gives me a negative 30 over 70. Negative 42%. So if we're thinking about helping an industry by imposing a tariff, we better be careful that we've done our math and we've kind of thought the whole system out, because this is kind of an interesting wrinkle to it. All right, questions on that? Who, if anybody, gets help with this extra measure? Government collects maybe a little more money, maybe, if we didn't kill things off too much. But yeah.
Foreign people, foreign producers.
Foreign output maker.
Yeah.
Nope. What do you mean foreign? Why do you say that?
The people that, the Japanese DVRs that have 30, but they got less than 60.
Yeah.
Almost like paying the tariff, which means.
Yeah, they're still getting their 60 there. There's one group here that might be getting helped, but we have to kind of read into the story a little bit. Let's go back to case one. Who got helped domestically with this situation?
The producer of the DVRs.
Yes. Which producers?
Domestic producers.
Domestic producers of the DVRs. So, if we add now intermediate good tariff on components, who potentially gets help?
Component producers?
Component producers that are domestic. Domestic component producers, we didn't really model them at all or talk about it, but if they have a big enough lobby with their politician, maybe they're the reason that it got passed through. So, because they're now getting $90 on their components compared to getting 60. So that's a possibility. Okay. Any other last questions there? All right, I want to get into quotas today.
Rob, did you get a chance to post our homework for this class yet?
No.
Pretty close to your deadline.
Yeah, no, you're not creeping up on the deadline because we're still there. But why don't we just let's just make it Wednesday. I don't care for you guys. You guys can do it this weekend. I'll get it posted so that you can work on it this weekend if you want. Okay, so that'll be chapter 5. We're in chapter 6 right now. Well, if it would have been Monday and we told you Monday that it was Wednesday, that you're in a worse position, right? So we got.
I hate seeing the hour thing click down.
Does that stress you out, seeing that hour thing click?
You should know by now that I everything off as possible.
Quota. What's that?
Restriction on how much you can produce.
Kinda. A little more meat on that. It is a restriction on. It's a restriction on quantity. What kind of quantities?
Production or
As it relates to international trade, I guess I should say. Go ahead, Adam. Okay.
imports.
Imports.
It's a restriction on how much a country can import a certain good from wherever.
Okay, so it's just the quantity coming over. So instead of zapping them with a dollar amount of tariff or tax, we're just going to say, hey, you were bringing 1,000. Sorry, you can only bring 500. That's all we'll allow into our country. So a quota is a restriction on the quantity of imports. Now, in other contexts, I mean, it is more generically can be just a restriction on production, like you said. All right. So what happens in our model? So I'm just going to draw our country here that is our importer. So there's some world price that's nice and cheap. And at that world price, consumers are buying that amount. Domestic producers are producing this amount. So this horizontal bar, which is not really much of a bar yet, put a little splash of red in here. This horizontal distance, that translates down to a real quantity. If this was 1,000 and this was 300, it'd be 700 units, right? So if we do cut that in half and we say, okay, you're doing this amount now, what if we impose a quota and say you can only do half as much? So I guess I will put, let's say this is 300 units and this is 1,300 units. So there's 1,000 units coming in from overseas. What happens if we limit that to 500 units? So let's suppose we impose a quota equal to 500 units. What's your predictions? The bar floats up, okay. How's it going to float? Okay. So one way to think about it, I like your visual here of if we take this red bar as being 1,000 units and we say that now it's only 500. Is there equality of supply and demand? The current quantity supplied at the world price of $6, at this price of $6 in this country, does the quantity demanded equal the quantity supplied?
No.
No. So that's the imbalance, right? And so is there a shortage or a surplus? Shortage. So domestic producers are still producing 300. I'm kind of like looking at an instant in time. Like we pass the quota and we say, okay, they're doing 300. The rest of the world used to be doing 1,000, but now they're doing 500. 500 plus 300 is 800. The quantity demanded at a price of $6 is 1,300. So there's a shortage of 500 units, right? We got this being our 800 units. 500 from the rest of the world, 300 domestically. Classic shortage. In the face of a shortage, what happens to prices? They go up. Right? So the prices are going to be bid up. And so now we start to see this bar creep in. And what's happening to domestic production? To eliminate, basically one of the questions to look at is who can eliminate the shortage? Who's able to eliminate the shortage right now of 500 units?
The domestic producers.
The domestic producers. They're the only answer, right? We can't go to the rest of the world for it. So if you think of it that way, we're going to start having domestic producers fill that gap. And they're going to ramp up production until the shortage is gone. And the shortage is gone right here. So such that the 500 units now fills that void. And that's where it stops. And that tells you the price with the quota domestically. Let's call it PQ. So after the quota is put into place, the price rises up to this amount. All right, now we can kind of do something similar to what we did before and make these areas. Let's go ahead and I'm going to dash my line back out there. I don't know how ugly your graph is getting at this point. But that's basically looks like the tariff situation, right? If you step back and look, this could have been a tariff equal to that amount. So that's one thing to take away from this, is that there is always an equivalent tariff that will give the same effect as the quota in terms of the domestic prices that are left over afterwards. So those two policy instruments can be set such that they deliver the same domestic price at the end of the day. The welfare distribution of the benefits will be different, though. How much government revenues with this situation? None. All right, we just said quantity can't be 500. So with the tariff, we've got the tax revenue. Here we don't. So that tax revenue piece was equal to this area when we had the tariff. Whose is it now? Who gets the tariff revenue, quote unquote? Producers. Which ones?
The domestic.
Domestic? No.
Where?
The foreigners. Right? Check it out.
Extra money to
So kind of, yeah, follow the logic here. So the foreign producers end up being able to sell in these markets and the price rises up, but they're not having to pay that to the government. Now, their quantity went down. So it's possible, depending on the size of the areas here, they used to sell 1,000 to the Americans, and now they're only selling 500.
They're getting a higher price, so it's worth it.
But, well, no, not necessarily. Not necessarily. It depends on the size of these areas. So let me try to get A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. All right, so let's do our welfare analysis. The change in consumer surplus. Sorry, my letters are a little goofy there. So, free trade versus quota. C, D, E, and F, all the way up to F, because consumers had this area. They were buying 1,300 units at a price of $6. So they used to have this. Now with the quota, they only have A and B. So they lost minus C, minus D, minus E, minus F. Change in producer surplus. Of course, this is domestic producers because we're concerned about the welfare of our country at this point. So B and C. So they used to have G. And now they've got added on to this area. So you said what? C and D?
I said change
Add C. Add C. Okay. So we're going to add C, right? So the change in producer surplus was a plus C. Change in government revenue again was what?
0.
Zippo. Add them all up. We've got all the players, plus C, minus C, and we're left with a minus D, minus E, minus F. And that is our deadweight loss.
Even though the foreign country, or the foreign producers get E, it's still their deadweight because it's not part of ours.
That's not part of ours. Yep. Because what we're comparing is what used to be ours is no longer, right? Because that belonged to our consumers. Area E was our consumers. and it's gone now. So it's still a dead weight loss. All right, looks like we got to get out of here. Have a good weekend.
Will our illustration appear on Blackboard, or I guess we don't have Blackboard for this class, do we?
Most likely, yes.
Do you have Blackboard for this class?
That's what I was trying to remember. Yes, we do. I'm kind of questioning whether we're going to use it or how much we're going to use it. I was wanting to use Blackboard for